Running from late 1999 to early 2000, Infinite Ryvius is a lesser-known property from Studio Sunrise. Since watching in 2012, it's been something I've wanted to revisit, and now that I have, I can say that I was very glad to do so. The show is very much the product of the post-Evangelion anime industry, but at the same time, Ryvius still stands on its own. Taking place in our solar system over 200 years into the future, humanity has spread out in response to the Geduld, a sea of burning hot fog making space travel dangerous. When a group of conspirators invades an astronaut training school during break to get at the secrets within, the remaining students are forced to flee on the powerful Black Ryvius, also called Bratica. But as dangerous as those who are led to believe the passengers of the Ryvius are terrorists are those passengers themselves. The children forced into their situation need to contend with the difficulties of forming order among their often lackadaisical or lethargic peers, the blind leading the blind. But a premise is just a premise, yet even in its execution it presents a number of interesting ideas. It is a flawed work, what isn't, but if that premise sounds interesting to you, then I'd highly recommend giving it a look, whether you track down the show for yourself or keep watching. Spoilers. Being a character-driven story, Ryvius has no shortage. Aiba Koji is the most prominent lead, acting with his best intent, but usually going with the flow, sometimes to the frustration of others due to his lack of skill. One such person is his brother, Aiba Yuki, who is far more skilled but less willing to act due to his targeted nature. Needless to say, their relationship is strained. Hosen Aoi is a childhood friend of both of them and wants them to be happy, but she's a bit in over her head. Oze Ikumi is Koji's friend and is righteous to a fault, but beneath those good intentions is a heavy trauma he never wants to relive. Fina S. Shinozaki is a sweet, forward-thinking girl with strong beliefs tying into the cult on her home of Tatiana Uranus. There's also Nea, the ghostly girl in a weird outfit who seems tied to the ship in some way. Piloting Ryvius is Zwei, the group of cadets whose navigation training leads to them taking command despite any opposition. This includes the loud, self-proclaimed leader Luxin Hojo, the rational and talented Julie Bahana, Good Turtlin III, also called Charlie, those other guys. Then there's Blue's gang, and the Orbital Security Bureau, and Kozue, and Reiko, and many more. Across the show, all these characters in some form take part in their own power struggles on scales large and small. In stabilizing things, Koji, Ikumi, and Yuki end up working with Zwei initially. However, when discontent begins to rise, Heirs Blue and his gang take control, wielding power to restore order and no small benefit to his allies, forming a dividing class structure. In trying to find a region of the solar system that will take them, their acts of self-defense leave them labeled as terrorists. In response, they are hounded by a Vaya-type ship much like the Ryvius called Blue Impulse. Eventually, Blue is overthrown, control returning to Zwei. Unfortunately, this only makes things worse as the systems Blue's gang put into place to maintain order fall apart without the loyalty and power used to manage them. Those in charge continue to suffer, reaching a boiling point in the battle against Crimson Decastia. In the aftermath, Ikumi's desire to protect the passengers of the Ryvius against themselves leads to him taking control, instilling an even greater fear than Blue ever had. Then, in the final encounter, they only barely fend off the Grey Goose Pence before being rescued at last. While the struggles of the main cast through the waxes and wanes of chaos and control on the Ryvius are engaging, it's further contextualized through the minor background characters. Even the word minor might overstate their importance. Some of them never interact with more than a few main characters, if any at all, only being seen regularly in the background of the show. Distinct character designs helped a lot, but this had some neat results. These passengers, figuratively and literally, give the Ryvius its soul. The state of the Ryvius can easily be read by the mood of its passengers, whether they are celebrating victory, working diligently, languishing in despair, or engaging in chaos. When we see the effects of events on these minor characters in particular, some of the results are so character-specific they wouldn't have worked otherwise. While these side characters might sometimes seem goofy, potentially feeling at odds with the dark and serious premise, it instead works in its favor. The playful moments happen organically, and the lightness in the face of such a bad situation is something the characters desperately need. If the show were hopelessly dark all the time, one would wonder why the characters were continuing on at all when it just seems so bleak. This could also be tiring for the audience. For that matter, when things come crashing down, it hits just that much harder. The duality is huge for Nea's character, but I'll get back to her later. Besides, if it was so straight-laced all the time, then some of the setting elements would start to feel awkward. For instance, the Geduld kind of doesn't make any sense at all. If space is a vacuum, then wouldn't it just spread out everywhere? But if you say gravity is somehow latching it to the solar system, then wouldn't the planets be covered in it? And then there's a psychic space squid zombie ghost girl just floating around. But those are things you can't just leave on the cutting room floor. The Geduld is initially a major source of environmental danger and continues to be of tactical importance in both travel and combat. The oddities that are Nea and the mech Einwald give plot importance to the ship and drive the outside conflict. Einwald actually adds a lot to interactions inside the Ryvius as well. Normally in a show with such a large cast, having only one mech would cause problems. Either no one would want to get in or everyone would. So to handle this, Einwald is operated primarily by 5 main programmers and about 20 secondary programmers writing code on the fly. Early on, it's so clunky to control that even the most basic tasks need sub-programmers against the weakest of obstacles. But near the end, when Ikumi goes off, he's gotten skilled enough that he could at least move around on his own. If Einvolt was easily piloted by one person, you'd be asking why no one had tried to take it sooner. That's not to say it wasn't attempted, but it failed due to lack of unified thinking, which is where most of the conflict comes from. In a ship with hundreds of voices, hundreds of inputs, in the end someone has to act, but whether or not acting is the right thing is questioned throughout the show. In particular, it emerges from the abrasion between Koji and Yuki. Koji believes that one should do the best thing that they can manage at the time, but for all his trying, he doesn't have the skill to back it up, sometimes troubling himself and others. This leads to him sometimes warming up to both sides of a conflict to stay on everyone's good side, which earns him similar ire. Yuki in particular finds this hypocritical. As he puts it, if the best you can do is still bad, trying is just detrimental. Koji's occasional fence-sitting or tendency to play devil's advocate, or blues advocate, make it easy to see why Yuki feels as though Koji is just a shallow person. He himself is good at a few things, but his inaction everywhere else leads to him avoiding most people, even when doing so keeps him at odds with his own flesh and blood. Shades in this spectrum can be found across many of the other characters as well. Luxon's role as leader is typically repeating things the smarter but softer spoken Julie says. Julie is skilled but full of doubt, and when she's voted leader, she's unable to meet expectations in the role she never asked for. Aoi's indecision when it comes to her friends often leads to her clumsy actions or just not doing much at all. Blue acts in his own interests, whether they align with someone else's or not, and his similarity with Yuki leads to a one-sided rivalry. Ikumi's strong will to do what he feels is right becomes darkly twisted when he's faced with his personal traumas. Nea, who is mentally in tune with the passengers of the Ryvius, initially acts only to save them, as survival is the one thing they can agree on. But in the end, neither Koji or Yuki's philosophies is really correct. They both are. In the end, Koji accepts that while doing the best you can at any given time is good, sometimes the best thing you can do is in fact not to act at all. While struggling to survive had kept them going thus far, they'd become so wrapped up in their struggle that they couldn't seriously consider being rescued by the enemy as an option. Overall, it's handled well enough, but a couple points don't quite line up. See, the Ryvius is part of the Vaya project, along with the other vessels. These ships have a unique power source in the form of the Sphex, like Nea, and the result is something that can, in 1,000 years, take humanity out of the doomed solar system. The Orbital Security Bureau's desire to capture the ship quietly leads to the beginning of the story, but Vice Minister Berkovich is willing to shoulder the losses for humanity's future. Infinite Ryvius is a coming-of-age story, so when Berkovich's assistant decides that helping the kids is the adult thing to do, it's pretty clear we should agree. However, Berkovich is ultimately successful, so it seems like the show is partly agreeing with his actions. Though the result is imperfect, it still emerges organically, so I don't think it's too huge a deal. What's more interesting, though, is how it's shown. There are more than a few lines of contrast to draw between those working for the Bureau and the passengers of the Ryvius. Berkovich claims that, if we worry too much about risks, we'll never take action. This and his overall conclusion that the ends justify the means makes it easy to contrast with those aboard the Ryvius. Yet his actions come across as less acceptable, as when the passengers of the Ryvius take reckless action or disregard consequence, you can rationalize it by the fact that they are children under intense duress. Some of that duress is personified in the opposing ships the Ryvius goes up against, each of them representing something plaguing its passengers. The wrathful aggression of Blue Impulse's commander leads to him being baited while Blue is simultaneously overthrown by angered passengers. The pride of Crimson Decastra's crew has them underestimating their opponents, while the passengers of the Ryvius act out against the main cast, particularly those with special status being perceived as lesser or unskilled. Conrad's fervor has him wanting to charge his vessel into the already captured Ryvius, just as Koji goes to talk to Ikumi and Yuki in an attempt to convince them that there's no longer need to act. And that's where Nea comes in. With the other captains, the Sphex only seems to be connected to a small crew. This has them overloaded on one emotion, one drive, seeing a dangerous foe needing to be crushed, a weak enemy needing to be taught a lesson, or a force pushing against their strong, ill-guided resolve. That single-mindedness fed back into itself, resulting in the mental destruction of the Vaya pilots. But with Nea, her ability to tap into so many minds and perspectives gave her far more. In the early part of the show, she was virtually non-existent as a character both in-universe and from a narrative perspective. Almost 100% of her dialogue and internal narration wasn't hers as much as it was the thoughts of the other characters, but as the series went on, those thoughts shaped her and she developed more of her own personality, doing things of her own will and getting her own dialogue. And through experiencing the good and the bad of the Ryvius, she comes to desire the good and is able to break Conrad's single-mindedness and allow him to see reason. She's still not fully fleshed out in the end, but she's much more than the blank slate that she began as. And that web of characters she watched is something quite rich. Every character trapped on the Ryvius is shown in the first few episodes, sometimes long before they become relevant. It seems obvious, but this is something important given the setting. If new characters were introduced later on as if they'd been on the ship the whole time, then they would stand out more than the background characters already do. The planning and foresight wasn't flawless though. Some characters fall to the wayside at one point or another. In particular, the girl Yuki breaks up with in episode 1 is clearly visible in the opening throughout the show, but all she does after that is join up with Fina. Conversely, Cullen, who's also there, only talks about music in most of her early scenes, but gets fleshed out better later on. Honestly, I could probably go on about the characters for a good while more, but it's something best experienced for yourself. There's just no way I could tackle everything in a satisfying way. From small things like Blue considering suicide when all seems lost in battle, or just Ikumi as a whole. Watching him descend from a positive, well-meaning bro to an absolute tyrant through the circumstances is just tragic. I hit the broad strokes, but I feel like even if I rewatched it again, I'd probably still be discovering the little things. Now, for all my praise of the show so far, it's not without its shortcomings. It's not the most well-produced show. Staring too long at scenes usually leads to noticing that the characters look just a little bit off or that the animation is a little rough. One of the lazier choices I noticed was the use of black borders often clouding up the corners. If it were implemented with a bit more thought or subtlety, it would be fine. It could have been a good way to make space feel more claustrophobic or show how trapped the characters are feeling, but it was mostly used to emphasize things regardless of the atmosphere of the scene. The effect was used in tight spaces and wide rooms, tense scenes, and light ones. It's just a lame way to compose frames. Thankfully, it's only overtly noticeable in a few episodes. Among other things that stand out, I think Nea's character design is worth noting. Most of the other characters are on the normal side. Most of them. But Nea's standing out fits her alien origin. Also worth noting is a general color palette. It's often faded and pale or dim and dark depending on where you look, and this matches the overall tone of the show well. There are also some differences between the first and last episodes and the rest of the show, when things look brighter before and after the Ryvius incident. Unfortunately, the editing is another weak point. Some action scenes can be difficult to parse. Thankfully, some good directional decisions and some interesting choices in pacing kept things from being as bad as they could have been. In particular, the choice to set it in space and how it was approached happened to do a good job of covering some of the weaknesses in editing. Battles are fought over the course of long periods, individual clashes being separated by hours within the same episode due to more realistically limited maneuverability of the ships. This allows them to naturally space things out more, focusing their efforts into those separate highlights instead of having one long mess of a scene. An example happens in the first episode. Even with the dialogue, it's harder than it should be to follow what's going on in the training exercise. This isn't untrue of the later fights, but the more distinct designs and having more time to stew it over does wonders. What also intrigued me was in some of the ways they reused footage. The dreaded recap episode is something reviled by both fans and staff alike, but sometimes they're necessary from a production standpoint. But rather than simply have one recap episode and take a week off, however, instead the recaps are placed organically into the episodes. 12 and 20 each dedicate about a quarter of the episode, while half of 22 is recap. The 3 attempts have some mixed results. The best example by far is in episode 12, where a man named Shinamura is looking into the Ryvius incident. It's no more than 5 minutes of recap, and more importantly, hearing about the events from a character who hasn't been involved in them gives a whole new perspective, the audience getting knowledge the main characters don't have. It wouldn't work for every story, but it's something I'd love to see more of if we had to have a recap episode. However, episode 20 fails in this as we get certain events from Aui's perspective. This is far less interesting as we already know her point of view. We've been watching it for 20 episodes at this point. The one in episode 22 is brought down a bit by its length, but since it follows Nea's emotional growth and what she learned from the passengers of the Ryvius, I'd set it in the middle, since we've kind of had her perspective but not really. To mention another directional decision, the musical choices are interesting. More often than not, it works. The scene of the Ryvius surfacing for the first time is downright stirring, in no small part due to the soundtrack. However, the editing issues occasionally crop up to hold it back. There are times when the soundtrack starts to build up before the scene suddenly cuts away, which is often jarring and not in a way that adds to the scene. However, while the series seems like it might fit sweeping epic scores as the Ryvius traverses the solar system, instead there's a strong rap hip-hop theme to much of the soundtrack. Unfortunately, it's average at best. At its worst... I'm not expecting Mad Villain here, but come on. Insert songs are one thing, but has lyrical background music ever worked? Still, while the implementation is less than stellar, why do it in the first place? I feel as though it's a statement of youth. Infinite Ryvius is a story about young people free from any adult influence, and it's pretty easy to associate hip-hop and freedom. There are other signs of this in the aesthetic, especially the title card, often written in graffiti. That messy freedom also shows as the Ryvius becomes more lived in. Plus, the clunky implementation is pretty easily explained if you assume the adults making the show aren't the most familiar with the genre. Not that I'm too deep into it myself, but I digress. Infinite Ryvius is rough around some of its edges, but it's still very much a gem. That said, I can easily see why if you happen to be in the crowd that doesn't care for it. The production faults in editing, animation, or music can weaken scenes, and the young characters making their bad choices or poorly formed arguments can be frustrating, even if I think it's justifiable in context. It's easy not to find the characters likable, though I think that they are often interesting enough to carry the show. I mean, it's not like this is a series of comedy shorts or anything. Thank God nothing like that exists. I wouldn't want to live in that world. Now, in closing, I want to come to the title. In the ending cards, we get a few interpretations on what Ryvius might mean. Reveal us, revise us, reverie of us, reeve of us, rave at us, raven us, revert to us, re-awake us, review the earth. Whatever you feel like it means, I'll end with revisit us. I enjoyed coming back to the show this time, and I'll certainly be visiting the Ryvius again.